In today's video, we are making design number 7, the Divided Crosshatch. It takes the Crosshatch Grid to the next level. It adds a layer of intricacy to the design and makes it look so much more complicated than it actually is. But it's so easy to sew, so let's find out more. Hey, I'm Tom, I'm the Colourblind Quilter, and you are watching This Is How You Quilt It, where we are on design number 7. To remind you, we are making a flip book of 21 all over fast and easy quilting designs that you can use for picking and choosing how to finish your quilt projects. But we're not just talking about drawing lines and sewing steps, we're actually looking at real example quilts to show you what's possible with these designs. I think when we're unable to visualize what a finished design will look like, it encourages us to procrastinate and not finish our project. So I'm aiming to help you with that through these example quilts. If you're just starting out on this series, welcome and thank you for joining us. In the description below, you'll find the free worksheet that has the prep and all the supplies that you will need to join us and sew along in this series. There's also a link in the corner and in the description to the playlist so you can catch up with all the other videos that have already been released. And remember, stick around to the end of the video so that you can see those example quilts that I was talking about. So let's get started then. So as I mentioned, I really love how complex this design is, or at least how complex it appears to be. It's really actually very straightforward and simple to sew this. Like the crosshatch grid though, in the previous video, we have to make sure that we plan and make sure that our crosshatch is symmetrical, otherwise this design is not going to work. On the difficulty score, this gets a 3 out of 5, and that's really not as scary as you think. The cuddle rating, however, this gets a 4 out of 5. This is a fairly dense and stiff design, so it does lend itself to wall hangings and table runners. However, on large quilts, it's much easier to space this further apart, and then you can get a softer, fluffier quilt. So just bear that in mind when you are deciding the distance between your grids. Now this sample requires some prep, then sewing, then some additional prep, and then some final sewing. So let's walk through this. Now this begins exactly the same as the crosshatch grid. We are going to mark our grid lines. Again, I am spacing my lines 1 1/4 inches apart. So we begin by drawing a line from corner to corner in both directions to mark an X through the middle of our square. Then we take our ruler and we line up the 1 1/4 inch line along the first line that we have drawn, and we mark that line. And then we continue lining up the ruler with the drawn lines, so 1 1/4 inch lines each time, so that our lines stay as straight as possible, and we work our way out to the corner. Then we rotate 180 degrees, line up the 1 1/4 inch line on the ruler with the center line, and then mark, and then continue working out to the corner. Then rotate 90 degrees and repeat that process from center to the corner, then rotating 180 degrees and then center to the corner, and then it's all your lines. We will be drawing additional lines, but we are going to sew these lines first. Again, the sewing is the same as the crosshatch grid. We begin by securing our sample by sewing the X. So sew from the corner to corner, cut your threads, and then sew corner to corner, and then you can remove any pins if you are using pins. Now rotate 90 degrees and starting on the left edge, sew all the way across to the right edge, skipping the center line that has already been sewn. Repeat until you reach the edge, then rotate 180 degrees and then sew the remaining lines. And that is the initial crosshatch grid that we're going to use. Now we need to go back and do a little bit more prep work. We need to now draw straight lines that are going to intersect through this grid. So wherever you see two lines crossing, and like this, we are going to place a line down the middle of it. So you're going to take your ruler and you're going to line it up so that it passes through all the intersecting lines in the center. Take your time, make sure that everything is as straight as possible, and then mark your line. And then you're going to repeat this all the way across the quilt. Now, if your initial grid is gone a little bit wonky, do not worry, just align the ruler as close as you can to the intersection and it will be fine. Once you've drawn all those lines, you're going to rotate 90 degrees and then you're going to repeat across the block again. And you'll end up with a straight line grid that intersects all the crosshatch grid. If you're using a pencil to mark your fabric, having a really sharp point on the pencil will make it much easier to get accurate lines that intersect. Now at the sewing machine, we start on the left edge and we sew from the top to the bottom of each of these guidelines. Cut your thread at the bottom and then keep going until you reach the right side. When you reach the right side, we are going to pivot the block 90 degrees and then starting on the left edge, we are going to sew all the way across again. When you reach the intersections, you'll find it helpful just to slow down, making sure that you get as close as you can to the intersection. If it doesn't quite intersect, that's okay. It's no big deal. Don't worry, don't stress. It's okay. It comes with practice and you'll get better and better every time you sew this. Chances are nobody will really notice anyway. Once you've sewn on a line, you're done. So that was how to prep and sew the divided crosshatch grid. As I promised, it's no more difficult than the crosshatch. It just requires a second set of prep to draw the straight lines that intersect. But the design really isn't complicated. It's one of those designs that looks way more complicated than it actually is. It just takes time to do the prep. While this will look amazing on square quilts, it does work on rectangular quilts. It just takes a little bit more planning to make sure that the quilt is symmetrical on both sides and that it's going to fit and fill the space as required. And if you want to use variegated thread on this design, it will just take it to the next level. And in fact, you could use two colors of thread for this, one for the initial grid and then one for the diagonal lines. And that would create a really stunning visual look on your quilt. You can make this incredibly dense by sewing things very close together, which would be great for table runners and wall hangings, or you can sew them further apart to get a softer and fluffier quilt. Just be sure to check the batting that you're using and how far apart you can quilt it. And when it comes to planning the crosshatch, just be careful, you need symmetry, so the corners all have to be the same. If you end up with a weird gap on one side, then this design is not going to look right. If you want to challenge your straight line sewing skills, you can mark your initial cross on the block, then get your walking foot guide out, set it to the distance that you want, and then use the sewn line to guide you across your quilt. Then when it comes to sewing the straight lines, you can draw one line down and then use that as a guide, or you can just eyeball it down the quilt. It's a great way to practice. It can be a little harder this way, so don't necessarily jump straight to it if you're not confident. Mark all your lines first and then build up to sewing it like this. Now let's look at some example quilts using this quilting design. So here we are with our first example, the trusted carpenter's square. You do know I love this quilt if you haven't already guessed that from all the examples I use using it. Now I absolutely love this. I think using the divided crosshatch takes this to the absolute next level. Now if we look first of all at the borders, look at that beautiful border, how it creates those squares on point and how they just fit perfectly. That's just really frames the design very nicely. And next, look at the center star. Notice how it's creating a pinwheel in the middle, but it's also creating quarter square triangles. The way that I've designed this, it just intersects through all the lines, along all the lines of the half square triangles and through all the squares, and it just creates so much visual interest. And now I'm completely torn because I wanted to do the carpenter square with the starburst, but looking at this, I just think this is absolutely stunning. So I don't know which one to do, but I love this. This would probably be quite dense, so this would be suited for a wall hanging, unless this was a huge 100-inch square quilt. So when you're thinking about using this in a carpenter's star, just maybe think about how big the quilt is so that the lines are not too close together and you don't get too dense a quilt. But yeah, wow, love it. For example number 2, because we used this in the crosshatch grid, I'm showing you what this looks like again. So this is the checkerboards on point. Now again, let's start with the borders. Look at that little border that this creates with the quilting. Now that was completely unintentional. That was a side effect of this design when I was laying it out. But actually, I love almost the feeling it creates. It's like a piano keys, but with triangles. And then I love how it creates that little motif in the corner there. It's very cool. If we look through the background squares first, we can see how it creates that sort of starburst in the middle of the squares that radiates out, so that's very cool. And then on the checkerboards, it again creates that radiating starburst from the center of the checkerboard. It's maybe a little difficult to see with the color of lines that I've used. Perhaps lighter lines would have been a little bit better to let you see that. But I love how this works. This feels very purposeful. And what I mean by that, it feels like the quilting design was made for this quilt pattern. It fits the pattern perfectly, and I absolutely love it. And so I really love when a quilt design comes together like that. So that would look amazing. Again, though, just be careful of the density of the quilting. Depends on the size of this quilt. If this was a twin size quilt, those line spaces would probably be okay, but on a smaller quilt, this would probably be very dense. Now, I thought perhaps we would have a new quilt example for this video, and I wanted to do this twister board, I guess you could call this. Yeah, twister board. So these are basically just circles on a background. And I have used a very wide spaced grid here. I wanted, when I planned this, to make sure that the diagonal lines went through the centers of the circles, cutting them in half. Then I wanted to also make sure that the straight line grid went through the centers of the circles so that it chopped them up into little Trivial Pursuit pie holder things that you get in that game. Now, this is really nice. This is a lovely example of how straight lines can really complement and create secondary patterns on a curved quilt. This turned out really nicely. And I do like the borders as well. There's a slight suggestion of X's there with the way that the lines crisscross. And I think that doing this on a big quilt, this would create a lovely soft fluffy quilt because these lines are quite far apart. So I thought you would appreciate seeing a slightly different example quilt. Okay, now hold on to your hats for design number 4. So in the divided crosshatch, last time I used the square and the square quilt example to show you if you played with the spacing of your lines, or if you put two lines together and echoed them all the way through the quilt, you could do something very special. With that in mind, I've taken that design and then I have added in my straight lines running horizontally and vertically, again in pairs, but I've played with the spacing. So they're not where you would expect them to be. You can see that the two vertical lines are running to the right side of the square and square block, and it creates those star points, quarter square triangles, don't know what you want to call them. Now we have the second column and they are on the left-hand side. And so then if we look at the corner of the quilt, these 4 blocks, you can see how it now creates this absolutely stunning star in a square with sashed corners. I really particularly like this because this feels very artistic. It feels very modern. It shows you that playing with the spacing of lines can create so many different effects. Like if I look in one place here, I can see a star. If I look in another place, I can see half rectangle triangles. If I look in another place, I can see a square with a stripe through the middle. It creates all these different things for your eyes to look at as it travels over the surface of the quilt. It just goes to show that with a very simple design like the divided crosshatch grid, which essentially is just a crosshatch grid and then straight lines drawn through it, tweak the spacing, play with the spacing and the alignments, you can come up with something that's very clever, looks very complicated, but is actually really easy. So maybe give that one a try. I'm going to give it a try, I think, because I really like it. So those were the example quotes, something a little different this video. I hope you liked them. So that was the divided crosshatch design, and those are the example quotes that I came up with, and I hope that you find these really helpful with your own projects. Don't forget there is an accompanying book that will be coming out later this year, and it will contain all of these 21 designs, and there will be step-by-step instructions and diagrams for all of these designs, as well as 9 additional designs that won't be appearing in this video series, and I'll be packing it full of information and resources that are going to help you with the quilting process. So this will be a great resource to have in your studio. So if you want to get notified when pre-orders open, do make sure you sign up to the mailing list using the link in the description below. As you're sewing along with this series, I'd love to follow your progress, so share your pictures using the hashtag #ThisIsHowYouQuilt and tag me, the Colorblind Quilter, so I can follow along with all your progress. In the next video, video number 8, we are doing zigzag matchsticks, and you're going to love this one. So if you like this video, do consider giving it a thumbs up, make sure you're subscribed and you've clicked that bell so you'll get notified when the next video in this series comes out. And until next time, take care.